Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another Canada update. So, before we get into the rest of the video, I will just once again say and shout out to all my members that thank you for your contributions. It's really helpful, and if you want to support my channel, by all means, go down below and press the join button and pick whatever tier you want. They all are equally valid and all help quite a lot. If you can't afford to do that, perfectly understand. That makes sense. The economy sucks. In which case, just do your basic YouTube things. Like, share, comment, all those things. Well, with that, let us get to the rest of the video. So, we have been seeing this trend now for a while. So this is not really that surprising. Poilievre is gaining ground. End of story. Close the video right there, right? Well, there is actually more going on that's worth discussing than just the Conservatives are gaining ground. And yes, you could go point to seats like Sackville, Preston, Chesapeake, or Cardigan, or places like Mississauga, or northern Vancouver, or actually just anywhere in the lower mainland. And be like, yeah, we could total up tons and tons of seats. And yes, while I don't have them projected there right now, the Conservatives are on the trajectory to getting about 213 seats, plus or minus a little bit. It's never certain. Every poll changes that number where they're trending towards. That's how polls work. And we're seeing a lot of movement now. Now, there's some inklings that we might be seeing some upward positive movement for the Conservatives, but for a while now about 6 or 7 weeks, the Conservatives have more or less seemingly plateaued. But we've been still seeing a lot of movement even with that. And that's with the Liberals' decline, which I kind of touched on in the last Canada-wide video. And it's very similar points to that. But we have more going on here than just that. It's not just the story of the Conservatives gaining ground. It's not just the story of the Liberals slowly, not even that slowly, frankly, but assuredly imploding. Rocketing towards their floor quite rapidly. Some of the recent polls, Liberals as low as 22, 23. Many at 24. Now, I have the Liberals a good bit higher than that still, just because of my model is intentionally slower than the polling average, just because between elections, I'm not really sure how valid the polling average is by itself. No fault to pollsters. It's more of a factor of they can only get the sample of people who respond to the polls, and a lot of people don't respond to polls in between elections. But also, things like strategic voting are a thing, and I still suspect NDPers are going to strategically vote Liberal, and that orangey, reddish swing voter category, the NDP Liberal swingers, you might call them. Now, how much longer that is a valid assumption holds, I'm not so certain. And the reason for that is as the Liberal vote falls and approaches the NDP vote, that calculus short circuits. We saw this in Ontario in 2022, and to a lesser extent in 2018, and even today, currently in their polling aggregate. The Liberals and the NDP are about the same vote share, so strategic voting doesn't really work, and you end up seeing a lot of hard vote splits in every single seat because no one really knows. The strategic voters don't know who to vote for. The anything but conservative voter, you could call them. It's too unclear to them. Now, people like myself or sites like 338 or other election modelers like Too Close to Call, for example, you could look at their sites and figure out how to strategically vote, but that's still not foolproof. We get things wrong frequently. Now, we're better than we are worse. accuracy rates are usually 90% plus, but that still means miss rates are about 10%. And you can never have much better than that because there's just so much that goes on into an individual race. The candidates, what's said, what's done, how much effort's been put into it, the national campaign, how it interacts with the demographics of that writing, etc., etc. All of these things are just so complicated. There's so many things that goes into it. That's why the models can't be 100% accurate. We can't simulate real life. If we could, we wouldn't do elections anymore. There would be no point. They'd be purposeless. But this brings us back to the main and important question here. The underlying character of the country. And that's the thing that I think is starting to bubble in people's minds. But I don't think it's quite manifested yet. It hasn't quite finished the thought. Especially in a lot of mainstream commentators and in actual published newspapers or TV news either. What does it mean that Poilievre is getting 40% of the vote? What does it mean that places like Abacus Data are suggesting he has a ceiling of 54%? What does it mean that myself estimate his ceiling to be around 47% based on all the polls I've looked at? And I will just put a caveat between myself and Abacus there. I don't think we're both wrong. Or either of us are wrong. Because Abacus is reporting people willing to vote conservative, which is 54%. And my ceiling is what he could actually attain. These might not be two different numbers. There might be people who are willing to vote conservative but won't. Because they have a better option in their mind. That's one of the things that makes this complicated. But fundamentally, what does it really mean that we are seeing these numbers? These blow out the numbers Stephen Harper got. Not even close. He could barely even, he couldn't even breach 40%. And now Poilievre is blowing past 40%. We have many polls with him, 41, 42. And again, he seems to be on the trajectory to possibly hit 47. Can't guarantee that's going to happen, but he seems on that path. He seems to be on a path to get the most seats ever won. Now, he does have an advantage in that metric because there are more seats now. But even with that, there are oodles and oodles of seats he has access to. And if you ignore Quebec, he is already probably at the most seats ever won, even relative to the number of seats. He's only low compared to like Diefenbaker or Mulroney just because Quebec hasn't moved yet, which we should expect because many in a time, Quebec commentators have told me, Quebecers don't really pay attention to federal politics too much because the provincial government matters more to them. So they don't really get activated until closer to election day usually, which is why Quebec seems to move so much during election time periods. That's just when they're paying attention to national news. Now, another part of that is just language barrier. A lot of national news is in English, and a lot of Quebecers don't speak English. I don't know call the exact percentage off my head, but I want to say about 50% of Quebecois don't speak good English at all. And of those who do, still another 30% only barely know English. They can probably talk to you, but that doesn't really mean they can follow a politician in English, because they're different things. Like talking to your friend about playing a game or going to a restaurant is quantifiably different than understanding what a high-level discussion like politics is. Now, there are many Quebecers who can do this, but not all of them. So it makes sense that they don't really pay as much attention, according to the Quebecer commenters and such that I've talked to. So let's pause it then. Let's say Poilievre does actually end up doing well in Quebec, because there's some polling suggesting he might be around 30% right now. My model aggregate does not have him close to 30%. He's like 23 or something. But let's say he is. He gets 30, 35%. Well, then we start seeing the Conservatives are winning 20, 30 seats in Quebec. Let's say they pick up 20. Now they're at 207. You add that 20 to their other 213 they're trending towards, which is in Anglo-Canada, and we're looking at 233. That is one of the best showings proportionally. Might be the best, I'm not 100% certain, but definitely the best in raw seats. Period. So what does that mean? Why is that happening? Is it just a fluke? Is it just because of inflation? Like you look in the UK or you look in Germany or recently New Zealand or other countries, the incumbent government is just getting destroyed. Is that just global trends caused by mismanagement during COVID that's coming home to roost for governments who are in charge? Maybe. Maybe Poilievre's doing nothing remarkably notable. Maybe he's just the beneficiary of trends that are beyond him, that he has no control over. And that is a valid conclusion, but I don't think it is the correct conclusion. One thing that is really important when analyzing trends, especially in politics, but this is true in things like economics or whatever field you're talking about, is backwards causality. Now, with backwards causality, what that means is that someone conflates and confuses the ordering of events and gets the wrong conclusion. An example of backwards causality that I have mentioned before. In 2008, many states and many counties in the U.S. South voted further to the right than they did in 2004. The rest of the country voted further to the left. Now, the backwards causality people see this and say, oh, this trend was because of Obama as a black man, so these people are racist. It's not, strictly speaking, an invalid conclusion, but it's very almost certainly backwards causality because there is a much better explanation for it. It's not that they didn't vote for Obama because they are racist. They didn't vote for Obama because there was underlying trends that was causing those regions to shift. A similar and important thing to note in those particular states, and you see this occasionally mentioned before, or time and again, is these days, is that they're often very poor states. And you will see, generally speaking, Democrat or Democratic-aligned people saying, why do they keep voting for Republicans when they are so poor? Again, an example of backwards causality. Those states are poorer, and they vote Republican. So the conclusion is they are poorer because they vote Republican. In reality, it's very likely that they vote Republican because they are poor. Now, that might not make sense because normally the Democrats do better with poor people, so why would that happen? Well, these states used to vote Democrat. Super hard. Places like Mississippi voted Democrat for almost 160 consecutive years. And then only recently started voting Republican. The last 30, 40 years. And they were poor that entire time. So arguably, they already did the thing people are saying they should do. They are poor, so they should vote for the other party, because the party they're currently voting for isn't doing anything. Again, backwards causality. So what does that have to do with Canada? Well, yes, there are international trends going on, but that international trends going on are not necessarily, they could be, but they're not necessarily the causative factor here. The reason why Polyev is shooting up, it could very well just be the fallout of actions done during COVID has doomed basically every single incumbent, regardless of their merit. That could be true. That could be this entire thing. This isn't Trudeau's fault. This isn't Poilievre's fault. It's the backlash to COVID. Could be. But it's not a very compelling argument. Because, and this is very important because, it kind of implies a level of powerlessness. Oh, the governments that be had no culpability. It was not their decision. They did not make mistakes. In reality, they almost certainly did. In almost all cases. So if we want to put aside the theory that this is just a short-term backlash or a short-term trend, what are some other possibilities? Why might this be happening? To me, the most compelling one, now I am extremely biased because this is my own theory, is that this is a deeper manifestation of how demographic aging interfaces with politics. So if you've watched my Understanding Politics series, specifically the coups, revolutions, and civil wars, specifically the second half of that video, you should watch it if you have not already. There is a concept I touch upon there called the democratic revolution. Now, this is a property, the democratic revolution, that is intrinsic to all democratic systems. The reason for this is it's the artifact, it's the consequence of how voters interact with democracy and how the aging of voting blocks interacts with democracy. Fundamentally, every generation that exists, and yes, for the most part, generations do exist. They have fuzzy boundaries, but they do have a clear character. When that generation is formed, when it becomes a real mature force that has agency, so they're adults, have jobs, go to university, whatever, they have a character. And that character can change a little bit over time, can evolve a little bit, but it's not going to change dramatically because adults don't really change their beliefs that much. Let's take the archetypical example, the boomers. Boomers today are very much the same kind of voter as they were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There would be very few boomers voting in the 60s, but you get the point. They're very much the same kind of voter. So what kind of voter is that? Well, they're very liberal. Now, today, many boomers vote conservative, much more so than they did in the 80s and the 70s, but that's to be expected because as people experience life events, which I touch on in Do People Get More Conservative as They Age? Check out that video too. As they experience life events, people tend to get more conservative, but that doesn't change their values, per se. Someone's values, their worldview might be set, but they could still become and vote more conservative out of self-interest. If you work and have a house, you want more stability. You want lower taxes. Like, fundamentally. That's where we get this meme of a lot of conservatives just wanting to conserve GDP or the tax rate. Low tax liberals, if you will. It comes from this older boomer style conservative who are coming less and less now as the boomers are getting older. Aging, as you will. Because that's what they were. Fundamentally. They were liberals who wanted lower taxes. Okay, so generations of characters, and the boomers were liberals and eventually became liberals who want lower taxes. How does that interface with today? Well, if you read Strauss-Howe generation theory, which I recommend, it's a bit academic, but very informative book. Generations work cyclically. There's cycles within cycles within cycles. The most generic cycle is one generation to the next generation. That is itself a cycle. As, for example, the boomers have been aging out of the workforce and Gen X has been taking over the workforce. Gen X's views have been coming into place. Slowly and surely. Though, unlike previous generations, the boomers don't really retire, so they stick around a lot longer than normal in jobs and stuff. So that's one cycle. Another cycle seems to be roughly this 4-generation cycle. Now, where this 4-generation cycle comes from is the basic understanding that the average person lives about 80 to 90 years at most. Period. End of story. Almost no one lives longer than that. And those who do live longer than about 80 years tend to either not really matter anymore for voting purposes. Either they're too old, or they don't really vote anymore, or the demographic becomes so dwarfed by the rest of the population that they're not very significant. Yes, I'm sure you can find silent generation types who are still alive in their 80s who can still vote and are still coherent and are still good people. But there's so few of them, they don't, strictly speaking, matter when it comes to politics. Their influence and their vote as a generation block is not very significant. It's cold to say something like that, but that's what it is. So we get this 4-generation cycle, in which is basically the time it takes for Generation A, in this case, let's say boomers, to no longer become relevant in democracy. Well, society as a whole, but in this particular case, democracy. And then we have what seems to be a fuzzier 240 or so years cycle, which seems to be about the cycle of like an idea, but that's fuzzier. We won't really get into that here because it's not that relevant for the topic of the video. And there's more cycles after that. You can just keep expanding the cycle idea. Though the more you expand it, the harder it is to really provide convincing evidence because there's just less time to look at them. But anyways. Now, in Strauss-Howe, they lay out their argument for when the generation cycles are and such like that. And according to their theory, we are in one today. Near the end of one today. The boomers are the start of a generation cycle. So, as they die out, they are the end of one. Usually, and almost always, these generation cycles are marked by the turning point is something big, something dramatic. In the case of the boomers, it was World War II / the Great Depression. It's a bit fuzzy. Boundaries are always fuzzy, but it's roughly that. That's the dividing line. Today, it seems COVID might be that line, which is where we get this backwards causality coming in. It's not so much that COVID, in the aftermath of COVID, destroyed incumbent governments, more so that COVID really is the line we see this framing switch. So then you might ask, why does the framing switch? Okay, people are aging, but why does it switch? Fundamentally, any ideology you can picture, your favorite, your least favorite, even ones such as conservatism, which I touched on last week, which are mostly not products of man, but somewhat products of man, because everything's a product of man that we talk about here because we are men. they're all, as a consequence of being artifacts of man, flawed. There is no perfect ideology. They are all inherently flawed because real world life is more complicated than you can summarize and explain in theory. As a really unpolitical example of this, look at physics. We have absolutely no idea how gravity works, period. Is it string theory? Is it something else? Why is gravity different than electromagnetism? We don't know. You go really deep into theoretical physics, there's a bunch of explanations, but there's no dominant one. There's no one that's clearly correct. Maybe one day we will have one. That just moves the question one step down. There's a never-ending barrel of questions in science. That's literally the point. That's what science is. It's a never-ending barrel of questions. And if we ever got to the bottom of the barrel, I have no idea what we would even do with that. So since every ideology is necessarily and inherently incomplete, what seems to happen over the course of a generation cycle, and the generation cycle is basically propagated because the first wave of said generation cycle, in this case the boomers, strongly adhere to one ideology. They kind of push that forward. And that becomes a dominant ideology of their civilization. But then eventually, because necessarily all ideologies are inherently incomplete, you start getting an artifact and a buildup of bad things. Failures. Systemic errors in society. And as these systemic errors build up and build up and build up, it seems, a breaking point where it just no longer makes any sense. The ideology is broken. It's disillusioned. People don't understand it, don't want to follow it. And you can see that happening right now with young people. Because keep in mind, the generations themselves don't really change. Boomers are still liberals. Young people, though, are not. You look at polling on this, young people seem very split between conservatives and progressives. There's various flavors of progressive and there's various flavors of conservative, but we're going to simplify to just that. It's not clear yet which one of those should win. But one of them will win, because there's never been an example of a society that was equally possessed by two ideas. It seems that every single society will always be possessed by one main dominant idea. For now, we don't quite know which one that is, but it's very clear it won't be liberalism much longer, because young people are not liberals. You can go to places like TikTok, and you can look at progressives on TikTok, and they use liberal almost as a slur. You go to conservative spheres, and almost the same thing happens. Liberal's almost a slur. You don't want to be a liberal in these circles. Being a liberal is bad. So if there is this change that seems to be occurring in the youth, which we would expect based on theory, and we're at the end of a cycle, and there is this systemic buildup of failures, which I've touched on in previous videos, but just to hit the nails on the head, housing is too expensive, no one's having kids, everyone's really unhappy, cost of living is outpacing wages, people's jobs are mostly meaningless, the amount of jobs that are basically pointless that exist are crazy. That's just the high notes. All these things are building up and building up and building up. Young people are disillusioned with it. And then something happens that is like the final nail on the head. And the reason why it's the final nail on the head is because it makes someone realize, wait a minute, this is stupid, and they can try to fix it. I don't think it's a surprise or a shock that if you look at people who've won elections recently, in New Zealand, I can't think of the guy's name, Geert Wilders in Netherlands, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, the Finnish right, don't know any names of the leaders there, the Scandinavian or the Swedish right, again don't know the names. Place in the UK, we have Keir Starmer, who looks like he's going to win. In Canada, we have Pierre Poilievre, who looks like he's going to win. In the US, we have Donald Trump, who looks like he's going to win again. Though, I'll put an asterisk on that. Eventually I'm going to do coverage of the US, but not right now. What do these people have in common? Well, they're all remarkably less liberal, in rhetoric at least, than their opponents. Now, I wouldn't say they're all the same orientation on the political scale. I mean, as much as we can even say is a scale. I think it's too complicated to be a scale, but anyways. They don't have all the same beliefs or values or goals, but they have very similar rhetoric. They have very similar commentary. They're very clearly drawing from a very similar well, and are using a similar well to attack the incumbent government. And they're usually attacking the incumbent government from a more conservative position, for now. Let's pick, as a case study, Keir Starmer in the UK. The Tories are, by every measure, objectively a liberal party. Right liberal? Maybe, but they're objectively liberal. They're liberal on economics, they're liberal on social policy, they're liberal on immigration. They sometimes use conservative rhetoric, but they don't actually mean any conservative rhetoric. Because they don't ever do it. And they have full power to do anything they want right now. For example, the Tories will routinely say, we're going to fight against illegal immigration. We're going to fight against or reduce immigration. They have full power right now. They have a complete 70-seat majority or something like that. And they haven't done anything. The numbers are higher than they were before. Then you look at what Keir Starmer is saying. He's saying he's going to bring immigration down at 200,000. He named a number. I want you to understand how bold it is to someone to name a number when you're talking about anything. Period. Because that means you have an objective criteria to say he failed by. Someone can look at Keir Starmer as Prime Minister of the UK in, let's say, 2030 and be like, you said you're going to reduce immigration to 200,000 and it's actually 900,000, sir. What the heck? You can do that because he said a number. But it's not just immigration. There's all sorts of things. I can't name them all off the top of my head because this is not a UK video and I didn't refresh myself all the details. Where he's outflanking the Tories from the right to the point that a lot of left-wing people actually really don't like Starmer right now. Now there's the question of, is he truthful? Is he genuine? Can you even trust him? I can't tell you that. But it's interesting and notable that he's outflanking from a conservative position. Same case in every other example I've said here. They're outflanking from a conservative position. Now, I will note that this should not necessarily be universal. Not every country is going to have the same generation changes, the same cycles. That's not a thing. Everyone's generations are going to be slightly different. But Western Europe is going to be broadly similar. The Anglosphere is going to be broadly similar, so it's a valid comparison. At least mostly valid. So let's bring this back to Canada here. What does this mean for Canada? Well, It does indeed seem to me that Poilievre is tapping into, either consciously or unconsciously, what seems to be this demographic change. This political viewpoint change propelled by the generation cycle ending. And as long as he stays true to that vision, it really does seem like he should keep going on to win. It's one of the reasons why Trudeau seems completely incapable of solving these problems. Usually people argue, at least I see, that Trudeau isn't solving problems in Canada because he is incompetent or he doesn't care. And I think part of doesn't care is valid. I don't think it's because he's incompetent, though. I would argue that Trudeau is incapable of fixing things like housing prices because he doesn't understand why they're falling apart. And that might seem like he's saying he's incompetent or he's an idiot. But not quite. I'm saying he's very ideological. I think he fully buys in to this liberal idea of a liberal Canada, backed by liberalism. And that if he does this, enough liberalism, Canada will be great. And it's not. And it's failing. And he doesn't understand. It doesn't make any sense to him. He's a liberal. This should be working. This is what liberalism calls for. How could this be failing? That's why you're starting to see him do interesting things right now. A lot of attacks. Because he doesn't know what to do. His framework doesn't work here. His worldview doesn't work. You can't solve the problems of liberalism with more liberalism. It's just not possible. That's the issue Trudeau seems to be running into, based on theory. So you might then contend, based on theory, what happens next? Well, if Poilievre acts accordingly, and he does a good job, competence always matters, because even according to theory, you can still lose elections if you're bad. He should be able to govern with a strong margin for a long time. We saw this with people like William Lyon Mackenzie King at the end of the last cycle, when he rose to the Great Depression, where the more classical liberal view clearly didn't work. And that's when the more modern, not quite social liberal in the case of William Lyon Mackenzie King, but what became social liberalism kind of took off as a result of the Great Depression. So does that mean we're going to see Poilievre rule for like 20 years? Probably not. People don't really stay around that long. But it's not unprecedented. This would, if he does, in fact, or the Conservatives in total rule for 20 years, that would just be the fourth time this has happened. Federally. Provincially, there's been more and more times of that. Just recently in Ontario, provincially, the Ontario Liberals ruled Ontario for like 20 years. Just about. The boundaries are never going to be fully clear, fully cut and dry. But you see the point. So, at the end of what this really is, what seems to be really boiling down here, is this seems to be the losing grip of the boomers. That is causing everything to change. Right now. So suddenly. Now you might ask, but why right now? Again, it's simple. Gen Z is the fourth generation of the cycle. They are 3 generations removed from boomers. They are the kids of Gen X, who are the kids of the silent. And today, we're seeing the oldest Gen Z becoming able to vote, becoming able to participate in politics, starting to exercise influence. Now, we are early yet, so the influence of Gen Z won't materialize yet. The first term phase of this next cycle is not going to be dramatically different than the last phase of the last cycle. It's not going to be manifestly different. It's going to be slightly different, but not manifestly different. It's going to start becoming manifestly different once you start seeing Gen Z hitting an average age of 30. Now, I mean, the youngest Gen Zs are finishing university in their early 20s. The oldest Gen Zs are in their mid-30s, having kids, having houses, having probably important positions in companies. That's when you're going to start seeing this really take off, because people who have kids in their 20s and the 20 and 30-year-olds who have kids start having lots of pressure on culture because the economy is largely driven by economic decisions of parents for their kids. It's one of the reasons why Western economies are doing so anemic is we don't have any kids. Turns out having children is important for economic growth for lots of reasons, it seems. But again, out of scope for the video. So this all boils down to that specific elections matter, specific actions matter, specific policies matter. But there is underlying trends that occur in populations because of how people interface with the time they are alive. Boomers were very liberal because they grew up in a very prosperous time, in a time that had boundless expectations for the future, in a time where everything seemed to be working. At the time, liberalism was the dominant ideology, and everything was working. So they became very liberal, because everything worked for them. You get to Gen Z, nothing worked for Gen Z. They grew up through a Great Recession, stagnant economic growth, skyrocketing housing prices, decaying social interactions, collapsing church attendance, COVID, multiple serious wars on the horizon and or currently occurring, which are not as important for people in Canada, but are still a factor in the ease of people's minds. I can't tell you how this is going to make Gen Z act. I'm not prophetic, and there's too many details and too complicated for this. But it tells you that the world that Gen Z grew up in is different than the world boomers grew up in. Gen Z is going to be a different character, a different generation than boomers were. And since boomers are now looking in their mid-60s, 70s, even to their early 80s in some cases, they're going to have less and less and less and less impact on society. They're going to be losing their positions of power in companies and nonprofits and churches and etc. They're going to be losing their positions in politics. They're going to be shrinking as a demographic bloc and becoming less relevant for electoral politics. Meanwhile, Gen Z is going to be doing those things. They're going to be becoming in the workforce. They're going to be becoming members of parishes and churches, and they're going to be doing these things and taking over positions. They're not going to be the leaders yet. They're too young, but they're going to start. And as this evolves, we're going to see things change. Where things will go, I don't know. Theory can predict change will occur. Can't tell you what the change will be. That change really does seem to boil down to what the leaders want. They have to sell their change to this demographic It has to be different than liberalism, because liberalism failed them. And in a way, if you're the NDP, you will probably rue this moment. Because this was probably the moment, assuming Poilievre is competent as a prime minister, that they failed to win a generation. Because if we see Poilievre get into the office and he makes positive progress on all these core issues, even just basic ones like housing, you will probably see conservatism shape the next cycle. Whereas a more competent, more disciplined NDP might have been able to do the opposite. Just like at BC with David Eby. And before him, John Horgan. Well, with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next week, hopefully with a Quebec provincial video, but I'm not 100% certain just yet.